Author Andrew Solomon spent nearly a decade speaking to families where parent and child were not as alike as our genes suggest will be. He brought tens of thousands of pages of research together in his new book, Far from the Tree: Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity. And Andrew Solomon joins us now here at TVO. It's great to have you with us.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
This book, as I suggested off the top, has just got a ton of attention, which I'm sure you're pleased about. But I want to start with, before we start talking about the kids, I want to start talking about your own story, because you are the product of what I guess you have referred to as both a vertical and horizontal difference with your parents. Just explain what that means.
So I've categorized differences and said that there are many differences or many identities, which are what I've called vertical identities. They're passed from parent to child. So your race is usually a vertical identity. Your nationality in general is a vertical identity, the language you speak, so on and so forth. But I've said there are lots of other identities in which a child is born who has an essential and defining quality with which his parents have no previous experience. And such children have to find their community as they get often into adolescence, where they find other people who share the quality that they have. And those I've called horizontal identities because you learn them from a peer group.
And in your case, what is that?
It's being gay, I would say, above anything. I mean, I have many identities, as we all do, but I felt like the defining one for the purposes of this was that I was the gay child of straight parents, and that was bewildering and somewhat difficult for them.
Were they disappointed when you came out?
Yes, I would say somewhat disappointed. I think sad maybe more than disappointed, and anxious and not sure what to do with it, and concerned and upset. I would say they were all of those things.
Parents don't usually react the same way to this kind of news. Same in your case?
Yes, I think it was harder for my mother than it was for my father, but I think my father was less defined by his children than my mother was, and I think my mother had two concerns. One was that she thought I might have an empty, hollow, sad life without love, and the other one of which was that she didn't really like going out into the world as the mother of a gay child.
Why not?
I think she felt that somehow it was a flaw and a vulnerability, and she had an image of what she had expected life to be like, and she had imagined a wedding, and she had imagined grandchildren, and she had imagined all kinds of other things which at that moment didn't seem to be associated with being gay.
All of which have transpired, though.
All of which have indeed transpired, yes.
So is she cooler with this now?
Well, she sadly died 20 years ago, but I think she would be cooler with it now if she were around. And my father, who also struggled a bit at the beginning, has been hugely warmly embracing.
So your mother was obviously not around for the marriage and children part, but she was around for the "my son is not who I thought he was" part.
Yes.
And how did she end up dealing with that herself?
You know, there was a period in which it was very tense and difficult, and part of what I came to understand in writing the book is that there are two qualities that one looks for in one's parents at such a moment. One looks for acceptance and one looks for love. And often, if there's a deficit in acceptance, it feels like a deficit in love. Looking back on it, my parents loved me all the way through, and I knew that, and that never changed. But the acceptance took them a little bit longer to get to. They got there. My mother got there before she died, but there was definitely a very unsettled period where I felt like they didn't really accept me for who I was, and I was mad about it.
Not only did they not accept you, they tried to correct what I guess they perceived as a flaw in you. How did they do that?
Well, they didn't try to correct anything that they saw as a flaw, but I, at one point, when I was in late adolescence, decided that I would go for surrogates therapy. And so I went off to a place on 47th Street where there were women who worked there who were not exactly prostitutes, but also not exactly anything else, to sort of try to work this through. The tension for me really was that I so much wanted to have children. I felt that having a family was so important. I was so attached to my own parents and so eager to recreate that. But I really knew that I was gay, and so it was the struggle between those two wishes which seemed incompatible then, and as it turns out, aren't incompatible now.
At what age did you start to have thoughts that were out of the mainstream, let's put it that way?
You know, I think I knew from earliest childhood that I was a little strange and a little bit different. I was marginalized a bit. I wasn't as masculine as some of my classmates. I wasn't, you know, the popular kid who was good on the baseball team. At what point I began to understand that those ways of being different were associated with a sexual preference or an identity, that came rather gradually and later, I guess, through my teenage years and until I finally really came out in my 20s.
Much bullying as a part of your childhood?
There was a lot of bullying in my childhood, and it was it was enormously painful. And now that I have children, it's the thing I so want to protect them from. But yes, I think people saw that I was different, and people are cruel to people who are different.
Kids hate difference, don't they?
Yes.
You do discover this as you watch your children go through school. They want everybody to be the same, but of course nobody's the same.
Right.
It's a conundrum.
The kids hate difference, but I think a lot of the kids' hatred of difference is also fostered by parents who likewise hate difference. And part of what I would love to do is to be able to help make a more open society in which those differences aren't so marginalizing as they were. Certainly we've seen in terms of racial integration, at least in the United States that I live in, that there's been enormous progress, and that while in the 60s everyone was paying lip service to the idea that we were all the same, race was still very visible, and it's become much less visible. And I hope some of these other categories can make the same trip.
We've just come through a presidential campaign in your country where a significant chunk, let's say, of the Republican Party thinks that gay people are gay because they choose to be and not because they're born that way. Okay, I'm talking to a real living, breathing gay person here. Can you tell me your experience on that?
So I think that being gay is actually the common endpoint of a broad range of experiences. And there are doubtless some people who are gay because they're born that way. And there are perhaps some people who are attracted to both genders, but somehow feel more comfortable being with a man. And there are some people who perhaps through some early set of experiences get their orientation shifted a little bit. But I don't think that the freedom for gay people should be contingent on this model of sort of, well, you can't help it, so we'll give you some rights. I mean, we don't give rights to, I don't know, Mormons, for example, because they can't help it. We give them those rights because we think you should have the right to inhabit the identity and be the person you know and understand yourself to be. And it should be the same for gay people.
Okay, let's follow up on this fatherhood issue, because you pointed out you always wanted to be a parent, and now you are.
Yes.
How many kids have you, this is a complicated question, so let's go through this. How many children do you have?
So the answer I always have to give on that is it depends on how you count.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
I'll give you the sort of family story in as condensed a version as I can.
Okay.
My husband, John, who I've been with for 11 years, in the period before he met me, had some lesbian friends who asked him to be a sperm donor, and they created a son, Oliver. Tammy and Laura created Oliver.
You got the picture up there. Do you want to say who's who?
Oliver is the one in the red shirt who is sitting with my husband's arm over his shoulder.
Okay.
So Tammy and Laura produced Oliver. John was not the father, he was just the donor. Oliver was supposed to call him Donor Dad, but because he couldn't quite get that, he ended up calling him Donut Dad.
Donut Dad, all right.
A few years later, after John and I had met, Tammy and Laura asked him to be a donor again, and they produced Lucy, whose lovely picture we're looking at now. Mm-hmm. And so then they had those two children. And in the meanwhile, I had a very close friend from college who had for a long time who had been married and her marriage had ended in divorce. And I said to her, "Are you sad about being divorced?" And she said, "No, I'm only sad about the idea of not having children." And I said, "Well, you'd be the best mother in the world, so if you ever decide you want some, I'd be game to be the father." It never occurred to me that she would take me up on it. She lived in a world in which I didn't think it was likely. She was in the American Southwest in Texas. But a few years later, she came up for my 40th birthday party in New York, and she said, "You know what? I think this might be a good idea." And we realized that was what we both really wanted to do. So we have Blaney, and there we are with Blaney. And then John and I felt that it would be lovely for us to have a child who lived with us all the time. And so we decided to do that. I decided to be we decided that I would be the biological father because I was the one who had really pushed for another child. John was less sure about it all. We found an egg donor through an agency, and then Laura, the mother of Oliver and Lucy, offered to be our surrogate and to carry George. And there we are with George when he was 17 days old, I think, in that photograph, and already holding up his head. So
how precocious.
So Laura was our surrogate. And now, and in the process of Laura carrying that pregnancy, we got to be much closer to Tammy and Laura. The kids discovered that Blaney called us Daddy and Papa John. They wanted to call us Daddy and Papa too. So now we have these 4 children. They all call us Daddy and Papa. 5 parents, 4 children, 3 states is the kind of shorthand for it.
Where's the partridge in the pear tree?
Exactly, coming at Christmas.
Huh. Okay, that's quite a story. Now, Parenthood, has it turned out to be, George is what, born in 2009? So he's still a very young kid. Has Parenthood turned out to be everything that you thought it would?
You know, it's funny. When I was a little boy, I remember my mother saying, "The love for your children is unlike any other experience, and people who don't have children never get to know it." And it was a great compliment because there I was her child, and she was exalting it. When I was an adolescent, she said the same thing, and it made me really worried because I thought, but I might not have children. When I was in my 20s, she said, "The love for your children is unlike any other love, and if you don't have children, you'll never know." And it made me furious. I thought, I'm gay, I'm not going to have kids, stop saying that. And now that I have them, it turns out she was right.
She was right.
Yeah. I've loved it. I worried at the beginning. I thought, what if I don't love it? What if I do this and then I'm stuck with it forever? But I mean, they're lovely kids, but I think it's just the whole experience, the intimacy of it, the engagement. I mean, it has its ups and downs. You know, they have their temper tantrum days, but I really do love it, yeah.
How do you all make decisions about parenting?
So everyone has two legal parents. Tammy and Laura are the legal parents of Oliver and Lucy. Blaine and I are the legal parents of Blaney, and John and I are the legal parents of George. So all the decisions get made in conversation. But we all welcome any intelligence and perspective from the others. When it comes down to sort of finally putting the signature on the page, then it's whichever one of us is the legal parent. But we all collaborate and we all like each other. We have a really good time together. I mean, the book just launched in New York. Everyone came to New York. We were together for 10 days. It was heaven.
I was going to say, God forbid there's a divorce in this picture here, because it's going to be insane as you guys try to, I mean, it seems complicated enough trying to figure this out with you all liking each other. And even when parents like each other, there's plenty to disagree about. Have you found that yet?
Sure, we found things that we disagree about. We found that in the 3 different households that there are some things one person does one way and another person does another way. I mean, there are always things to disagree about. But maybe I'm being foolishly optimistic, and you'll have me back on the program in 5 years and years, but I don't see us heading toward divorce. I feel like it took us a long time to figure this out, and we worked really hard to figure out how to find these relationships and how to have a family. And we worked too hard on it to just let it go.
Okay. During the course of our hour-long conversation here, we're going to move from chapter to chapter, if you like, through the book. That's clearly a case of where parents love their children. We're now going to talk about a situation where the children are not quite so lovable. And let's move on to that. We've had a story here in Toronto this past week where the, I guess, perpetrator of a double sexual assault turned himself in. He got caught on a security camera while riding transit. And he showed up at the police station with his mother, who no doubt, like other people, saw his image on the news. Now, based on what you've learned from families where a child turns to crime, can you give us some insight into how parents process the notion that their child is a criminal?
Right. So I would begin by saying that historically, we've assigned many kinds of problems and issues to parents. We said that autism was caused by refrigerator mothers, gay people had overbearing mothers and passive fathers, people with schizophrenia had parents with a subconscious wish they not exist. If you go back 200 years, people thought that the reason for dwarfism and deformity were the unrealized lascivious longings of the mother. And we've given up on blaming the parents on all of those things, but we still blame the parents when kids are criminals. And sometimes the parents have done things which have actually contributed to the criminal behavior of children. So we're not totally wrong in that. But essentially, they're just exacerbating what's there or moderating it. A lot of the time, you just have a kid who's a criminal. And when I started working on crime, I ended up thinking it feels to me more like a disease than a lot of the so-called diseases that I'm looking at. My heart goes out to that mother. I don't know her, but it's perfectly possible, at least, that she was a kind, loving, generous mother who produced a child who did a terrible, horrific thing.
Here's an excerpt from your book, which reflects very much that which you just said. If you have a child who's a dwarf, you are not dwarfed yourself. And if your child is deaf, it does not impair your own hearing. But a child who is morally culpable seems like an indictment of mother and father. Parents whose kids do well take credit for it. And the obverse of their self-congratulation is that parents whose kids do badly must have erred. Unfortunately, virtuous parenting is no warranty against corrupt children. Yet these parents find themselves morally diminished, and the force of blame impedes their ability to help, sometimes even to love, their felonious progeny. Let's get into one of the, very nicely written incidents.
Thank you.
I told you already, you're a great writer.
Thank you.
Gandhi said, of course, hate the sin, not the sinner. What if your kid is responsible for the massacre at Columbine High School? How do you not hate the sinner as well?
So I spent a lot of time with Tom and Sue Klebold, whose son Dylan Klebold was one of the perpetrators of that massacre. And I went there thinking that when I got to know them, I would understand why this had happened. And the better I got to know them, the less I understood it. While I happen to be rather fond of my own parents, I would actually have been happy to be brought up by them. It's a lovely family, they're lovely people. We did our first long interview, which was a whole weekend. We recorded more than 20 hours of interviews, and we were all exhausted at the end of it. And we were sitting around the kitchen table having dinner. And I said, if Dylan were here now, is there anything you'd want to ask him or say to him? And his father said, there sure is. I'd want to ask him what the hell he thought he was doing. And his mother kind of looked at the floor and thought for a minute, and then she looked back up and said, I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head. And I just felt that that kept coming up. And I said, it must have been hard to keep loving him when all of this happened. And she said, no. She said it was hard to understand. It was hard to forgive. It was hard to interpret. It was hard to reconcile with what I already knew. But loving him, that was always easy for me.
Andrew, I must tell you, when I read that part of the book, I thought, I don't get that. And I'm going to ask you to explain this to me. God forbid, if I ever had a kid that did anything as heinous as what that kid did, there would be a part of me that would say, I wish he'd never or she'd never been born. More likely he, boys tend to do this kind of thing. I wish he'd never been born so that those 14, 15, 16 people he killed and all of the misery that came along with it never would have happened. I would think that at some part, in some part of myself. She never does.
If she could turn back the clock and save the people who died at Columbine, she would do it in an instant, and she would give up her own life to do it. I have no question about that. She's a very moral person, and she's horrified by the suffering of others, and she talked about how painful it was. She actually wrote letters to the parents of all the children who had been killed. It was then advised not to send some of them because they might re-traumatize people, but I mean, she was horrified by it. So there's no question that if she could turn it back and prevent it from happening, she would. I think the point she was making, however, is that she loved her child, and her child, as she once said, he had some form of an illness. The same thing that killed those other people at Columbine also killed my son. And what she'd like, I think, is to be able to recreate things in a way so that he hadn't done that. But despite the fact that he did it, he was her son. He'd lived with her for many years. I mean, I don't know whether you have children. I will tell you, my children are yes, excellent. So my children are flawed. I adore them. I love them. They're flawed. I'm flawed too. One has children who are flawed, and one doesn't want to exchange them for children without those flaws.
I know, but there was no, unless I missed it, there was no part in your reportage where she said, you know, I even feel guilty that I even had the kid. She said, I have nothing but joyous memories of being a mother, and I still love the fact that I am Dylan's mother. That just felt weird to me.
I think that's not actually what
I'm
she
reading
was
too much
saying.
into that?
Yeah, I think what she said was that she was agonized by what had happened, but that she nonetheless loved her child, even though she deplored what he had done and would do anything to stop it from happening.
Can she mourn his death?
I think she has mourned his death, and I think the difficult thing is that while the parents of all the kids who were killed had to mourn their deaths, she's had to mourn his life as well.
They stayed in Columbine, eh?
Yes. I was surprised by that, and I said, why didn't you want to leave after all of this? And they said, well, you know, if we'd gone someplace else, we would have just been meeting new people. And his mother said, everyone would have met me as the mother of that killer. She said, staying here, there were people who already loved us and who we could count on. She said, and more than that, there were people who had loved Dylan, and I needed that at a time when everyone in the world hated him.
But the suggestion seems to be that whatever it was that made him do what he did, it was a disease of some kind, or it was clearly not explainable by bad parenting, because you said they were great parents. Do they or you have any added insight into what that disease might have been?
You know, I think we're at a time when brain imaging is moving forward incredibly rapidly, and I think I know that there are already some studies that show that in people who are diagnosed as psychopaths, certain areas are overactive or underactive. But I think our understanding of the brain, as one person I was talking to when I wrote the book said, is like those photos of the Earth from the moon, where you can see the continents in the solar system, the ocean systems. And when you can actually read the license plates, we might understand where these things come from.
Okay, let me move on to dealing with children who may seem unlovable for other reasons. and you talked to parents whose children were conceived in rape.
Yes.
What commonalities did these mothers have?
So I wanted to look at the idea that dealing with a child who is extraordinary and who appears in some sense to be possibly unlovable entails dealing with a child who's born different, with a child who turns out to be strange or different, like the criminals. And it even applies when you have a child who comes from a strange and difficult place. I saw these women, and I want to emphasize, as I have all the way through, I saw women who had kept children conceived in rape, which does not suggest that I think women who have been raped ought to keep their children. I have no judgment on that. I feel people need to decide what's right for them. But I did find that many of these women loved their children, but also that they experienced a lot of pain in connection with them. I mean, the anecdote that in a way summed it up was when I was in Rwanda, where I went to interview women who'd been raped in the genocide. And I spoke to one woman, and at the end of the interview, I said, as I often do at the end of interviews, do you have any questions for me? And in Rwanda, people had said, will this be published in French? And did you get the spelling of my name right? And how long are you staying here? And this one woman said to me, well, you're in this field of psychology, right? And I said, well, yeah, more or less. And she said, can you tell me how to love my daughter more? She said, because I want to love her so much, but when I look at her, I see what happened to me, and it gets in the way. And I was so shocked, I was just standing there. And she said it again, quite fiercely. She said, can you tell me how to love my daughter more? And it was only much later on that I thought what a loving question that was.
How did you answer it?
Like that at the time. I mean, I think I said to her, give it time, and I hope you'll find healing, and just build your own life and include her. I mean, I came out with banalities, but afterwards I really did think that there's that wish to love the child is very strong, and a lot of these women had babies whom they felt they couldn't love, and over time they were won over by their children, because the children are people of them unto themselves. They aren't just the rapist reincarnated.
I guess part of the problem is if you're a victim of rape, there's a group for that. If you're an alcoholic, there's a group for that. If you're et cetera, is there a support group for people who've decided to keep babies that have been conceived as a result of rape?
The problem is that a lot of the support, there are support groups for such people. A lot of it comes from the sort of outer fringes of the anti-abortion movement. I found that a lot of these women, there were a lot of commonalities in the experiences I heard. One of the commonalities was that most of them didn't know about one another and felt alone and lonely and isolated. And part of the reason I included the chapter was because I wanted to say, this happens a lot. There are tens of thousands of rape-conceived children born every year in the United States. I'm sure there are many born even in peaceable Canada. And these people shouldn't have to be suffering in this kind of silence, but the stigma is so huge. And there's also the complexity that you have to decide at what point you're going to tell your child that your child was conceived in rape. If you have an adopted child, you tell them about adoption from the very beginning. But rape is both too violent and too graphically sexual to describe to a very young child. So there has to be a moment of revelation, and then the decision about how you handle things really has to be made with the interests of the child at heart.
Based on your experience, when do you have that conversation?
It really varies. I mean, some kids seem to be ready for it really early, and some kids find out much later on and are traumatized. I basically would say there's never a good time for it. I mean, the average is probably mid-teenage years. But mid-teenage years can be pretty tricky even without any surprise revelations.
Would any part of you recommend that conversation just never take place?
I think it's very difficult to grow up in the world with a secret that you might unearth at some point later on and that you've never been told. So I did talk to one survivor, I guess one child of a rape survivor. Her mother had died. She had found out what happened. She had never been able to talk to her mother about it, and she felt betrayed. So if you could keep it locked in the tomb, maybe that works, but tombs aren't well locked in this day and age.
I want to ask you about Brenda Henry. Is that how you pronounce her last name? She was raped as a teenager. She kept her baby. She found out her daughter was raped at almost the same age that she was. Discuss, I mean, I almost don't know where to begin with that kind of circumstance.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found is that there were some people I met who were raped in what we think of as the classic someone jumps out from behind a bush kind of way. But there were lots of people who, because of early experience or because of childhood sexual abuse or for any of a variety of reasons, didn't really know how to protect themselves well and kept putting themselves in situations of vulnerability. So I met quite a few women who had been raped multiple times. Brenda was, I think, not such a person. She came from a loving and supportive family, but after she had been through the experience of being raped and having this baby at 16 when she wasn't ready and losing the life that she had really hoped and planned to have, after she'd been through that whole difficult, painful, upsetting business, she had very shaky sexual boundaries, and it took her a long time to figure things out. And it was one of her boyfriends who raped her daughter. So that was unbelievably horrific. But when I talked to her about the whole experience, I said to her, do you think about the rapists much? And she said, you know, I used to think about them with anger, but now I mostly think about them with pity. And I thought she just meant pity because they were so unevolved to do something like this. And I said, pity? And she said, yes. She said, because they have a beautiful daughter and 2 beautiful grandchildren, and they don't know it, and I do. So as it turns out, I'm the lucky one. It was an extraordinary achievement of resilience. Now, if she could remake her life, would she want to be raped at 16? Certainly not. But given that that was what had been handed to her, she was ultimately able to find peace with it.
Amazing. Do you know how that happens?
You know, I think that time is something of a healer, but what I really ended up thinking, and I looked at the ways people construct meaning in a whole lot of situations in this book, and at first I kept thinking, as you were saying about Sue Klebold, how could she possibly really love her son? Or how could this woman possibly say it's all worked out well? And I thought in the end, it doesn't matter whether those narratives are true or not. It might be that if there were genuinely a choice, people would choose to have a different life or to have things go otherwise. But if you can manage to say, I found meaning in this experience, then you can find peace with it and you can be a good parent to your child. And if you say, it's meaningless and awful and I hate it, then you're going to lead a very tortured life. So would I have been happier being straight? Who knows? Who knows who I'd have been if I'd been straight? I'd have been someone else altogether. But if I spent my entire adult life thinking, oh, if I were only like that, it would be destroyed. And in fact, I've managed now to have a very happy life to just who I am.
Okay, moving from the unlovable child to a child not of sound mind or body, let's put it that way. You point out in Far From the Tree that raising gifted children or prodigies can be as difficult as raising a child with autism. Explain.
So the shorthand is that I think it's just as difficult to have the mind of a 25-year-old in the body of a 3-year-old as it is to have the mind of a 3-year-old in the body of a 25-year-old. And what I found with people who were dealing with children who had this really extraordinary, explosive, prodigious genius, and I focused on classical music because that's an area in which it often manifests, the parents were completely torn. Do I put my child with people who are his age peers, who can't understand a single thing he talks about? Or do I put him with people who are his intellectual peers, who are not really interested in the concerns of a 5-year-old? And so there's this constant struggle to find a context and to find a place. And essentially, the parents are confronted with a whole world of which they know nothing, and they have to become expert very quickly. And it was a lot like the experience of families of people with Down syndrome or autism in that regard.
How do parents, I think it's fair to say that parents, well, they don't want necessarily their kids to be just like them. They wouldn't mind if a little piece of their kid was a little bit like them. So how does a parent handle a situation where their offspring is really nothing at all like them, for all of the reasons we've just discussed?
Well, I think it takes a big leap of the imagination, and I think parenting altogether requires quite a lot of imagination. People essentially go into having children, by and large, with a fantasy centered around the word reproduction. Reproduction suggests that you're just making a little mini version of sort of yourself and your other half. Actually, what you're doing is producing someone, and what I found is that everyone's children are sometimes strange to them. Everyone sometimes has the experience of looking at their child or hearing about something their child did and thinking, where did you come from? And the process of reconciling oneself to that is it's a lifetime's project. And the families I mostly wrote about, some of the families I wrote about didn't, but most of them ultimately decided that they were going to embrace the children and acknowledge who they were.
What's the hardest part of parenting a child who's not at all like you?
I think the hardest part is the ignorance that you have about the child's condition, the difficulty of finding reliable information, and the feeling all the time that you're probably making a lot of mistakes. I mean, I think one of the things we often think when we're setting out to be parents is, my parents did all of these things wrong, I'm not going to do those things wrong, I'm going to be a perfect parent to my kids. But your kids aren't you, they're someone else. And so you're being the person who would have been a perfect parent to yourself. actually isn't the perfect parent to your child. And when you have the children with these extreme differences, I mean, I had so many people who are full of self-blame and self-criticism, and I did this wrong and I did that wrong, and if I'd known that sooner, and we should have started that therapy, they would go on and on like that. And I think it's that guilt. I think the guilt is the hardest part. I think it can even get in the way of love.
When I have talked to parents in the past who have, for example, a Down syndrome child or a mentally handicapped child, something like that, the thing that invariably comes up is, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to my poor kid when we're dead? You know, the kid is sort of hanging in there as long as the parents are alive and able to oversee, but what happens when the parents die? Right. What's the answer to that question?
Well, it's a hugely complicated and urgent question. There are not enough good facilities for adults with disabilities of any kind, anywhere, really, even in places where socialized medicine is working at its best. Beyond that, though, there's always this difficult question. Many parents say, as long as I can take care of my child, I don't want to put him in a placement in a home where he'll be taken care of by strangers. And there's a lot to be said for that. The problem is that then the person with a disability loses their parent and at the same time has to go into a completely unfamiliar living situation. So a lot of other parents have said, I want to be able to help my child with this transition so that when I go, he's someplace where they know him and he knows them and he has routines and he's used to it. The balance of when to do that or when it's appropriate, you know, none of us knows when we're going to die. We don't know when we're going to become too infirm to do things. It's very difficult to separate from a child you love who's still completely vulnerable, but it can be very dangerous not to separate.
Are you hearing more about murder-suicides and this kind of thing?
I'm hearing a lot about murder-suicides. They're frequent, and I found them particularly when I was working on autism, that there has been a steady run of people who have killed their autistic children, and I find it deeply distressing. The autistic children may or may not have been suffering, but there are many, many ways to address the suffering of such people. And I've had now quite a lot of experience with people with autism, and I certainly don't think that they'd be better off dead.
We have, not sure how much you know about this, but in Canada we had a case several years ago about a guy named Robert Latimer. He was a farmer and he was convicted of second-degree murder. He killed his daughter, Tracy. She was severely disabled. He said she was in constant pain and misery. He wanted to relieve her pain, so it wasn't a murder-suicide, it was just a murder. And he went to jail. I think a lot of people felt a lot of sympathy for Robert Latimer and not for the daughter. At least that was my impression watching a lot of the news coverage around this. Do you find it odd that in that circumstance people are sympathetic to this poor guy who's sitting in a prison cell just trying to relieve his daughter's pain as opposed to the daughter?
Right. I think that the question really is what the nature of his daughter's pain was. And I don't know what it was, and neither do you, and I don't know that he knew what it was. There are many people who have got terribly severe disabilities and who appear to be living in pain, but who are able to speak well enough to tell you that they want to stay alive. And there are plenty of people who seem to have everything going in their favor who jump off a bridge because they just find life unbearable. So what's unbearable for any individual is incredibly difficult to assess from the outside. My concern is that when we suggest that the lives of disabled people are less valuable than the lives of fully abled people, and that killing them isn't murder, and that the murders of such people are altruistic, we open the door, as has happened in the world of autism, to an enormous number of people murdering children and serving very little time. And if those children really genuinely themselves wanted to die, I have no problem with that. But if we're not sure they did, then I think it's presumptuous to make that decision for them.
And I don't mean to dispute what you're saying, but my recollection was Tracy couldn't talk or move, so she would not have been able to be helpful in offering an explanation as to whether or not the father was on solid footing here.
Right.
I don't know if that matters.
I wouldn't want to be someone who couldn't talk or move, but I have to say I have a great aunt who died at 106. She was in great shape till 99. By the time she was 105, I thought, this life looks so bleak and awful to me that she's leading. She wanted to stay alive.
How do you know?
She wanted to, well, she said so, and her actions demonstrated it. I mean, she was trying to take care of herself as much as she could. I've talked to people who have been in what appeared to be a permanent vegetative state and have emerged, who are very glad to have emerged in some way. I mean, it's unknowable. It's not that I think that poor little girl, she certainly wanted to be alive. It's only that I think it's dangerous to allow people to make these assumptions without a complicated, I mean, if she'd been assessed by 5 doctors and they'd all agreed and there was a protocol, maybe there would have been a way forward. But I think just for the father to judge that his daughter would be better off dead is a leap.
I'm going to read an excerpt from your book, so now's a good time for you to grab a swig of water.
Great.
Here we go. Labeling a child's mind as diseased, whether with autism, intellectual disabilities, or transgenderism, may reflect the discomfort the mind gives to parents more than any discomfort it causes their child. Much gets corrected that might have better been left alone. This opens such a delightfully ethically complicated can of worms as you have in your book. Let's go through some of this. If you knew you could give birth to a baby and avoid the baby having Down syndrome, avoid the baby being blind, avoid the baby being deaf, and you could somehow play with the genetics to ensure that that was the case, wouldn't that be worth doing?
There are two pieces to that, and there are two kind of conflicting ideas. The first is that I think it is genuinely right and appropriate that we help people who are in any kind of pain to alleviate that pain, and that we try not to cause people to suffer needlessly. Having said that, I think that there is a vital culture that comes out of the variety of humankind, and that standardization can be perilous. At the time that I was born, I think that the argument you've just made would have been equally easily made about gay people. Wouldn't it really be better if you could choose to have a child who wasn't going to have this, what at that time was considered a disease, an affliction, a sin, and a crime? Wouldn't that be better? And I don't know, maybe it would have been better in some ways. I happen to think that gay culture has provided a lot of depth and complexity, and I'd like to think I'm pitching into humanity at the moment. So I just think, certainly if I had a choice, would I like a blind child or a seeing child? I'd like a seeing child. I'm in no rush to sort of have my own children be in these categories, but I also think we have to recognize that the more we standardize things, the narrower the world gets, and just the way species diversity helps make the planet richer and better. So I think a diversity of abilities is valuable. And there are people who have autism who have gone on and created great science, and who knows, if Stevie Wonder weren't blind, whether he would have made the music he's made, and so on and so forth. I think the one-line answer is a difficult one.
You've had pushback on that, though. I mean, there are people who say, no, I don't want my deafness corrected. There's a whole deaf culture out there. And you are essentially assigning our culture to the extinction bin of history if you somehow come up with a cure for deafness. What do you think of that approach?
I think that the deaf culture, in which I've now spent a lot of time, is a real and valid culture. It's very compelling. There are many extraordinary people. It has its own language, it has its own traditions, it has its own theater, it has its own poetry. If I had a child who were deaf, I would probably get that child a cochlear implant, because there's nothing more important than being able to communicate with your own child. And I would want my child to speak the same language I do.
And all the people at Gallaudet would be furious with you.
And all the people at Gallaudet would be furious. But having said that I would do that for my own child, I would be sad if deaf culture disappeared from the face of the earth. I mean, cultures disappear and are born all the time. But I happen to think that those losses are real and that we should at least be awake to them.
Is it an arrogance on our part to assume that it's better to be, quote unquote, I was going to say perfectly able-bodied, but nobody's perfectly able-bodied, or almost nobody. But is that an arrogance on our part to assume that everyone ought to be?
I think most people would like to be fully able-bodied if they could, at least at some initial stage in their development. But I think ultimately, if you banish the dragons, you banish the heroes, and people get very attached to the heroic strain in their own lives. And a lot of the people I met in the course of rising up above such obvious challenges had achieved a kind of elegant nobility that they might not otherwise have had reason to achieve. I mean, there was one guy I talked to, for instance, who has a terribly disabling form of dwarfism, and his parents were told that they should just leave him at the hospital and not even take him home because he would die soon and he was never going to walk or talk. And his mother, who was an amazing woman, who was a phone operator and not particularly well educated or connected, managed to find the best doctor to treat the condition he had. She helped him to get through a variety of challenges. He had 30 surgeries in his early childhood. While he was stuck in the hospital all that time, he did a lot of reading, and he became the first person in his family to go to college. He now has a girlfriend with whom he's rapturously in love and who seems to be in love with him. He graduated with honors and has a fantastic job. He achieved at a level that his parents had never dreamed of for themselves or for any child they might have. So you look at something like that and you think, okay, it's not the life I would have chosen. It's had a lot of pain in it, but it would be too bad if the possibility of that kind of transcendence disappeared.
Okay, it gets murkier now. Let's talk about lawsuits over wrongful birth or wrongful life, because this is not the life I wanted to have as a child. I didn't want to be born deaf, and the fact that I am, I'm suing you, my parents, or I'm suing you, the doctors, or I'm suing whoever, because it's happened. What do we think of this?
Well, there are lots of people who sue doctors when the problem has come out of either an error that was given during amniocentesis or because of a traumatic birth. There are lots of disabilities that result from circumstances around birth. Wrongful life suits, which are the ones that are really at issue, are essentially suits in which you say, I wish I had never been born. But the people on whose behalf those are brought are almost never able to articulate that position. It's their parents who articulate that position, and the purpose of those lawsuits is to get the funding that will be needed to take care of a grossly disabled child over a very long period of time. So it's a sort of sleight of hand. It poses as an ethical question. It's actually an economic question.
What about, now, some states, I gather, have outlawed this, right? They've
Yes.
said you can't bring these wrongful birth suits forward anymore. Is that a good move, do you think, in your view?
I think that the problem, again, is that there's a poison that seeps out from those cases. I feel like people who have got children who are disabled should have enormous support for them, and they should actually be able to have housing and whatever kind of care is needed and so on without being driven to bankruptcy by it. I don't think that the way that those services should be delivered are through these suits, which seem to imply a devaluing of the lives of disabled people.
The Human Genome Project, how does that fit into all of this?
So when the Human Genome Project was being pitched to funders way back when, one of the ways that they got everyone on board was by saying that it would allow for all of these screenings that would allow people to correct diseases. And the implication seemed to be that there was a perfect genome and that somebody might have a perfect genome and that everyone else's might be imperfect in various degrees. And there are a lot of people who have got so-called genetic deficits who are unhappy with that suggestion and who have objected to it. I myself think the Human Genome Project is, one of the great triumphs of science of our times. And I don't like the area within the disability rights movement which sometimes seeks to curtail the progress of science. I feel like you really want to have two things happening together. One of them is that the science is progressing to give people more and more options not to have these issues, to live differently, to not to have pain. And the other is that you want a society that's so accepting that people don't feel driven toward that science. And if both of those things happen, you could have a more permissive world and also perhaps a happier one.
What do you make of the fact that the so-called pro-life movement has really, gravitated towards this whole issue in the way that it has?
Well, my own view, as I think I said before in the rape section, is that I really believe that the right to choice should belong solely to the woman who is pregnant, or to that woman and whoever the other partner is who was involved in creating the pregnancy. I think the pro-life movement, though, has tended to co-opt this issue, and I think it's too bad because their having done so means that people who believe in choice are frequently having to take the opposite position, when I think the correct position to take is that everyone should make the choice that's right for them, and we should provide enough information and enough social supports so that people don't terminate pregnancies that might have given them children who would provide great joy, and people aren't obliged to carry through in pregnancies that will bring them nothing but sorrow.
Another excerpt from your book. Mainstreaming, inclusion, deinstitutionalization, the disability rights movement, identity politics, all these forces both emphasize and normalize difference. They focus on securing accommodation of unusual needs while asserting that our most basic needs are all the same. They aspire to change the world so that more people can feel unremarkable in it. Again, beautifully written, very well said. The various families that you met who shared so much and so deeply of their own experiences, do they feel this way about what you've just said?
I think a lot of the families who I met, I'll give you another anecdote which I think answers the question in a way. There's a family I met who have a son with Down syndrome who's now 23 years old, or was 23 years old when I interviewed them. And they had struggled a lot with having this child, but they had ultimately become involved in changing the way educational services are delivered to people with Down syndrome. They started a tiny center that eventually grew to have a big influence on the way that most people with Down syndrome are now educated. And I said to them, it's been so central to your lives. I said, do you wish it had never happened? Do you wish you didn't have Down syndrome? Do you wish you'd never heard of it? And his mother said to me, for David, our son, I wish that he didn't have Down syndrome and I'd cure it if I could, because for David, it's a difficult way to be in the world. But speaking for myself, though I would never have believed 23 years ago that I could get to such a point, speaking for myself, it's made our lives so much better and so much richer and caused us to be so much better as people that speaking for myself, I wouldn't give it up for anything in the world. And that was the tension I encountered over and over again. You want to alleviate the pain of people who are in pain, and you also want to have the broadest possible experience of humanity.
There's an empathy that comes from that which you can't possibly have from having a quote-unquote normal child, right?
I mean, the people who were kind of the most normal in my high school class, who may or may not be watching this program right now, but I don't think they've gone on to have necessarily the best and brightest lives. I think that a certain amount of struggle can be advantageous. Having said that, I'll protect my own children from struggle as much as I can, but I do think that there are things that come out of struggle that don't come out of smooth sailing.
Isn't that interesting that parents all want their children to lead normal, simple, I mean, certainly full, but not sad lives, or certainly be shielded from anything that could potentially make them sad, but those are the things they need in order to thrive in the world. Why is that?
It's very unusual that someone actually is able to save their child from all sadness and pain. In fact, it's more or less impossible. So I think what parents are doing is protecting their children to the best of their abilities, because one of the elements of resilience is knowing that you have a family who tried to protect you. That's a very powerful experience.
Would you mind talking a bit about George?
I'm delighted always to talk about George.
George is what, 3 now?
3.5.
3.5, okay. 3.5. You are a parent, aren't you? Because a normal person says 3, and a parent, of course, says 3.5 or whatever. I want you to read just a little bit here from your book on the first day of life for George. And then we'll ask a couple of questions emerging out of this.
Okay.
Right from the red line, if you would.
By the time John and I had settled in our hospital room, and the nurse had given George his first bath, it was 2:30 in the morning, and we all fell blissfully into our beds. I am the heavy sleeper in the family, so I slumbered peacefully while John got up every few hours to check on George and feed him. When I woke up, John had taken George into Laura's room down the hall. Tammy and the kids were there eating cinnamon rolls, and the air was festive. John said he was going to lie down for a bit and that I should talk to the pediatrician. I'm the one in the family who deals with everything medical, and I thought this was the predictable stuff of day 1 in George's life. A hearing test, what to do about the hepatitis B vaccine, and so on. Blithely, I sat there eating, helping Oliver and Lucy hold the baby safely, and then the pediatrician came in and said she was concerned. George had not been drawing his legs up the way that babies are supposed to, and was instead holding them out stiff and straight for up to 3 minutes at a time. She referred to this as inappropriately high muscle tone, and said that it might reflect brain damage, and that she wanted to order a CAT scan. I asked whether this was unusual, and she said simply that it didn't frequently occur at this stage. Laura brightly volunteered that George was going to be fine, and everyone else went on with the cinnamon rolls, and I felt the inside parts of my body that are usually warm go cold, while the parts exposed to the air suddenly seemed to be on fire. The pediatrician calmly explained that the baby's unusual behavior could signal bleeding in the brain, and that such bleeding might resolve itself or might need to be alleviated surgically. She mentioned the knot in the umbilical cord and said we needed to be certain that it hadn't had an impact. She noted that his head was unusually large, which could be related to hydrocephalus or the presence of tumors. She added that he was stiffening one leg more than the other, which might mean that he had asymmetrical brain development or a mass in his brain. She was young, and I could tell that this was the steady, competent manner she had learned for the purpose of being honest with people. From the time George was conceived until that day, I had kept thinking how ironic it would be if, in the midst of writing about exceptional children, I were to produce such a child. I knew, though, that nature is no stranger to irony.
And what did you conclude when you were in the midst of this drama about that irony?
I first will say that he turned out to be fine, so it all ended up okay. I thought that while I had seen how valid and wonderful and amazing the lives of all of these disabled people were and what meaning their parents had found in the experience, I didn't want to join the numbers, and I didn't want George to join the numbers. I wanted him to be okay and undamaged, and I was going to do everything I could to keep him that way. And I remember thinking that I must love him a lot because I felt how hard I was trying not to love him in that moment of thinking how damaged he might be.
Did any part of you feel bad for feeling that way?
Yes, I did feel bad for feeling that way, but I knew that it was what I truly felt. But I felt good about the fact that I actually loved him enough to want things to be right for him. There's so much difference between the idea of a child, and for me at least, it wasn't possible to parse what that difference was until there was actually a baby in my arms, and then I suddenly saw it.
Let's come full circle. Your parents, how did you eventually come to forgive them as you have?
I think that when I was working on the book, I recognized that divide between acceptance and love. I recognized that my parents had always loved me, and I recognized that acceptance is hard, that none of the families I profiled said, oh, it turned out our child had Down syndrome and we never gave it another thought, or it turned out that our child was schizophrenic, but it never really kept us up at night, we didn't worry about it. Parents worry, parents are concerned, parents are upset. This is all part of what happens. And the question is whether it ultimately resolves into something that is positive and joyful. And the question is whether, even in the periods of non-acceptance, there's love. And once I had that standard, which I derived from looking at all these other families, I thought, actually, my parents did a pretty good job, all in all.
Can I ask you a few odd questions now?
Sure.
Now that you're a parent? You know, everybody, as I say, wants their kid to have as easy a road as possible towards happiness, however you want to define that. Have you and your husband asked yourselves, do we hope George is gay, or do we hope he's straight? You can't know that now, but that will become an issue at some point.
I've had other people ask me that on a number of occasions, and I think my feeling is that we're fine either way. I mean, if someone showed up with a magic wand, I think I would be unlikely to suggest, if some fairy showed up with a magic wand, that, that she make him gay, because I still think that gay lives are harder than straight lives. But if he is gay, I think we'll be able to guide him through the experience and help to ensure that he has a positive experience in life. I feel we have enough in common. I hope we have the same values. I hope we love the same people and some of the same things. I don't feel as though he needs to be exactly like us in that regard.
It's fascinating, though, that you, listen, you're a best-selling author now, and I can't remember what John does, but you guys have a nice life right now, right? And you're two gay men with a child, and you have a very nice life. And yet it's interesting that even you, in those circumstances, would still prefer, if you had the choice, that your son be heterosexual. That's fascinating, don't you agree?
I do agree, and what I think I said is that I think it would be easier for him, and therefore is probably the thing I would choose. There's someone I'm related to who's a child who's recently come out of the closet, and you pointed out at the beginning, children who are different get teased, and teasing is painful, and I'd like to protect him from it where I can. But I don't think that he'd have a worse life as a gay person. I just think he might face some different obstacles.
But if he's like his dad, he's going to handle it quite well.
Well, that's kind of you to say. Thank you.
Andrew Solomon, it's been awfully good of you. We've never done this before, where we've devoted an entire program to one interview on one book with one author.
Wow.
But this book, this is a big deal, this book.
Thank you.
And you've really broken some new ground here. And, a decade in the making means it's worth the time. Andrew Solomon, Far from the Tree, Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity. We're very grateful you spent so much time with us here at TVO tonight.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.